Good afternoon, everyone.
Sorry.
Okay.
Sorry.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have Professor Biju Mathew, who's an activist intellectual with a PhD from University of Pittsburgh. I'm here to talk to him about certain things, and it's gonna go on for like 10-15 minutes. The first question going on is the New York Taxi Worker Alliance is currently one of the most successful New York immigrant workers union in the US, sir. And how did you establish it?
So one, to begin with, it's not me establishing it. It's a group of us who really started working on it back in 1996-97, and we really established the union in 1998 in terms of an official organization. But we had already started working in 96-97. How precisely that moment came? I mean, I think it was a combination of multiple things. I think the post-1965, the Kennedy Act, which opened up immigration, the first wave of immigration coming from much of the quote-unquote third world, developing world, was a lot of professionals. You saw a lot of Indian engineers, doctors, etc. going. It was the middle class, the upper caste who was really moving. And but then during the mid-80s, the second phase of immigration started opening up, which was essentially the low middle class, the working class out of the developing world, given rapid changes to the third world economy, started migrating. I mean, for instance, if you really look at this is just an example, right? If you really look at it, a lot of Sikh Sardar taxi drivers in the taxi industry, and invariably almost all of them come from the Doaba in Punjab, right, which is the part between the two rivers, the most fertile, the most canal-irrigated areas of Punjab, right, which is also the heart of the Khalistan movement, which is also the heart of, so what does all of that point to? It points to the fact that by the 80s, you had high unemployment in Punjab. The agrarian economy that had been produced through capitalization had pushed a lot of youth out of the farmlands. Education wasn't fetching them jobs. The farm itself was going under crisis. So the best thing to do was to get one male child across to a developing, to another economy who would to a degree subsidize this thing, right? So in that sense, a lot of migration was produced out of the way the global economy began to restructure and the kind of third world economies began to form. I mean, I would meet taxi drivers in the airport holding lots in New York, let's say a Haitian driver, and I would talk to him and he'd laugh and say, I'm a Haitian farmer, man. And he would go back during those periods. He'd actually go back during agricultural season, just like Bihar migrant labor coming to Punjab would go back for a particular agricultural season to Bihar to harvest, right? I mean, so in that sense, the kind of the emergence of a new third world developing society, working class in American cities started happening in the 80s. And so when I got there for my PhD and I was doing that work, I began to really see this is the fastest growing segment of the working class. And the American labor movement was somewhat, right-wing at that point. It was anti-immigrant. It really felt that American jobs were being lost because of immigrants. That was not the case. American jobs were being lost because American capital was taking jobs to the maquilas in Mexico or to China. It had nothing to do with immigrant labor coming in. But that was where the American labor movement was. And so at that point, somebody like me, I just decided that it's an area that I want to invest in, really work with immigrant labor, build something new. And when I got to New York, taxis were serendipitous. I mean, I just happened to, I just needed to find somebody who would drink chai with me at 3 o'clock in the morning. And so that's where I landed. But then there were really my comrades in that struggle. Our current president of the National and the executive director of the New York Taxi Workers Alliance, Bharati Desai, a woman in the middle of an almost all-male industry. She's just an absolutely brilliant, mind-blowing organizer. And she came into the middle of it, and her energy and her passion, I would say, defined a lot of it. And then people like Javed Tariq, who's from Pakpatan in Pakistan, Javed is unrelenting. He would just not back off. Every time we fail, he would be there next morning saying, "Chal yaar, agla." Right? So it's just that spirit of a bunch of people, a group of drivers coming together, somebody like Bharati, who's just an absolutely brilliant organizer, somebody like me who had made certain decisions and had had made a decision that organizing was going to be part of my life. So things like that. So I think all of it came together really well.
Okay, sir. So the second question being, how did National Taxi Worker Alliances get created?
Okay. So we started out, as you said, as I said, when I came to New York to organize immigrant workers and taxi drivers was serendipitous in a sense, but I came to that decision because the American labor movement, the AFL-CIO, was at that point anti-immigrant, right? So there was no chance of a taxi drivers union being really part of the American labor movement. As a matter of fact, when we did our first strike on May 13th, 1998, nobody expected the strike to be successful except us. We knew we had done the organizing on the ground. We called for a strike. The mayor of New York dismissed the strike, saying, nothing's going to happen. Going to be a bunch of, a small group of drivers who are, just diehards, who are going to create a little noise. And the American labor movement dismissed it. They said there's not going to be a strike. The traditional union in the industry said, come along, give me a break. It's not going to happen, etc. But, May 13, 1998, wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and there's not a bloody taxi on the street, right? And so the AFL-CIO, for instance, actually asked for a meeting with us. But when we walked into that meeting, they were resistant. They were not even willing to listen to us as to how we actually pulled it off. They just said, do you guys want to join us? And we said, no. And we walked out of the room because we knew we didn't have their respect yet. So it all happened, over a slow period of time. What I was talking about earlier, we really reinvented the idea of collective bargaining for non-traditional workers, for independent contractors. And once some of that began to fall into place, I think the AFL, etc., began to take it seriously. And so there were many conversations. There were some really wonderful people in the AFL, people like Ed Ott, who was the director of the New York Central Labor Council, who really, even at the worst of times when, the AFL wasn't necessarily supportive, somebody like him was deeply supportive of us, right? And so over a period of time, it became clear that this was a new horizon, that we had created a new model, that we were pushing forward. And lo and behold, it all fell into place again in terms of the AFL-CIO actually chartering a new union after over 50 years. The last one that was chartered was the farm workers under Cesar Chavez in the 1960s. And then come 2011, we get a new charter for a national union. And so it's just a recognition of the work that had been done on the ground and an understanding that this labor force, this new horizon had to be something that the labor movement needs to take seriously, just as it needs to be taken seriously here in India in terms of some of the new kinds of things that, I keep saying there are multiple working classes here in India. The bank employees, need to look at what's happening to, taxi drivers. Taxi drivers need to look at what's happening to garment workers. Garment workers need to look at what's happening to home-based workers. Home-based workers need to look at, I think we really need to reinvent the labor movement along certain new lines here in terms of, really thinking about the fact that the economy is going to fundamentally alter and change in the next 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And so we need to be ready for that.
Talking about the Hindutva movement, can you talk about your stint as the convener of Coalition Against Genocide and your campaign of Stop Funding Hate?
Those are all things that we did historically in terms of the fact that, the campaign of Stop Funding Hate was something that came immediately after the Gujarat massacre. And we basically tracked $6 million that a secular front organization of the RSS was moving to India. And, basically it was going to the Bajrang Dal, to Vanvasi Kalyan Ashrams, etc. And the Coalition Against Genocide, similarly, it's a long, hard campaign, which had many good, interesting points, including points like when Modi's visa was revoked in the US, etc. But, I think the point simply, I think there are 2 or 3 things that we need to say. One is that there is a large Indian upper caste Hindu middle class which is sitting in the United States. I'm not saying every single one of them is Hindutva, but because of the class and caste nature of the migration, it's upper caste, they tend to be middle class, coming out of urban India, etc. There is a particular way in which I would say the per capita, the per square foot density of Indians who are Hindutva bound is greater in the United States than even in India itself right now, in spite of the recent ascendance of this thing. And, but those who are not really need to unify, because we really need to understand that a significant kind of momentum coming to the Hindutva movement in India is coming because of the diasporic power. And we need to really think about that, and I would say that people really need to take that part seriously and really influence, think about how to change that situation diasporically. The second thing, which I think is really the absolute center of the issue of diasporic Hindutva, is the fact that you would expect the diasporic Hindutva, diehards, they are right-wing. They are in that sense, they are right-wing nutcases of the variety where they really think that Muslims should not be part of India. They really think that minorities should be second-class citizens. They are followers of Hegdewar and Golwalkar, right? Now, what the hell are they doing in the United States? They are brown men and women in a society wherein they are minorities. And guess what? They actually love being minorities in the United States. And guess what? They are all, a large number of them are part of the Democratic Party, not the conservative Republican Party. They're part of the Democratic Party because the multicultural framework of the Democratic Party allows them to come in and say, hello, I'm a minority, I'm treated badly, I need to be part of some power structure. And the Democratic Party is like, okay, come in here, there's a big tent, right? Yes. So it's such a contradiction. It's such a double standard, right? That they can sit inside multicultural spaces, defend minorities, they take advantage of that in places like the United States and England. In England, they're all part of the Labour Party, right? They do that there, and then they bay for the blood of minorities here. It's just simply disgusting, and that's exactly what marks an organization like RSS. It is so opportunistic. It is so opportunistic that when the British were here and they seem to be the ones in power, they sucked up to the British, yes. Right? And so this is the level of opportunism that's there in the right wing, and that's exactly what they're performing back in the United States or England.
Going on to the last question, so can you tell us about what's your take on the right to equality in workplace in India?
See, it's what I said a few minutes ago, right? I think, right to equality, what is there to talk about? Of course it should be there, every kind of equality, but I think really think about it. In one of the panels today, this afternoon, somebody said about, Mihir Desai used the word judicial terrorism to describe what the Supreme Court does in the case of workers, right? One of the things I wanted to say during that period was that when that panel was going on was that, what is really going on in something, let's say, like the Supreme Court or some of these kinds of spaces, right? I'm not specifically thinking of the Supreme Court, but any of these kinds of elite spaces, right? In the 1960s, in the 1970s, we had, let's say, progressive judges in the Supreme Court or various institutions, various policy-making frameworks, legislature, all of these, simply because the idea that workers are part of a society and they need to be respected, and the idea that we need to drive towards a more equal society, all of those were to that degree coming out of the nationalist movement, coming out of the communist revolutions, coming out of the social democratic changes in Europe, were hegemonic. So, whether it is, any number of the Supreme Court judges of that period, whether it is, some of the people like, people who are going into legislature, they had a sensitivity to labor, they had a sensitivity to all this, and so we had a particular moment of progressive reform and all of that happening then. Now, think about this moment. Why is there such an attitude against workers in some of these places? It's part of your consciousness. It's not just that neoliberalism has influenced you and that there's an anti-trade union sentiment all over. No. I think it is these places, these policy spaces, these elite spaces are full of human beings now who over the last 20 years or 30 years look at workers with a certain degree of disgust, right? It's a caste class character. It's not just purely class. They know that the workers are coming from lower caste. And their internalization of caste, their internalization of their own privileges, the consciousness that comes out of all that is making them look at workers with a certain amount of disgust. It's the bodies of those workers that they hate. They want to banish them if they can, but they can't. right? So I really think that the left of center formations in this country, whether it's the communist parties, whether it's the socialist parties, whether it's some of the trade unions, whether it's some of the social movement groups, if you don't come together now to ask the question, what is the hierarchy within labor? How do you create particular kinds of unity? How do you, it's like what I said, the taxi drivers need to be looking at the construction workers need to be looking at domestic workers, the domestic workers need to be recognizing home-based work. Unless we are able to do all this and create a new unified social movement, not simply a labor movement, but a social movement that looks at producers. I mean, look at the street vendors. They're making food on the street, they're doing this, they're producers, they don't necessarily even think of themselves as workers, right? So I think we really need to create a new kind of a producerist worker kind of sensibility with especially women and children and all of those kinds of workers slash producers at the center of this formation, and with a certain kind of we need to go back to re-understanding how Marx thought about capital and workers in terms of how workers are located, and forget about certain parts of Marx like the mode of production debate, but really look at where surplus is being extracted and make that the point of organizing. We should really go back to Ambedkar and look at how he thought about the relationship between caste and class, especially his early formation of the Labour Party, etc., and really organize from within that space to create a completely new social movement that recognizes that we are entering a new phase, that we are entering actually a revolutionary moment, and if we don't have our act together, the fascists are going to take over. I think we just need to recognize that. Thanks.
It was a great honor talking to Professor Biju Mathew. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you so much, Amal. Thank you so much.